With 250 million inhabitants, 1 million troops, and nuclear weapons, Pakistan is a geopolitical giant. Yet the country only receives minimal coverage in international media. It's time to learn more about this South Asian country. Let's explore the geopolitics of Pakistan. Hello and welcome to another episode of Warrior Diplomacy, your favorite international relations podcast. So Pakistan is not only a large and powerful country, it's also located in one of the world's most volatile regions. It's right between Afghanistan in the west and India in the east. And for more information about those two countries, check out our previous episodes. However, we did not analyze Pakistan itself yet, which is why I'm very thrilled today to be joined by Calvin Nixon, who has lived in the region and studied it extensively. Welcome to the show, Calvin.
Yes, thank you, Aramis, for inviting me and talking about this very important country, which doesn't receive as much attention, at least in the West, as it should be. And yeah, looking forward to it.
Fully agreed here, and I think with that we can start with the first block, which is the internal politics of Pakistan. So Calvin, can you give me a quick overview of the history of Pakistan, the most defining political trends since the country gained independence from Great Britain in 1947?
Yeah, so this is, of course, a big question. I would make a bold move and say that Pakistan, even though it did have a lot of very important watershed moments in its history, the first really important moment in the history of Pakistan actually was before Pakistan even existed. So you said Pakistan gained independence in 1947 from the British Raj, as did India. But, of course, the countries which we know today as Pakistan and India were one colony under the British rule. And the idea of Pakistan actually becoming a country stemmed from the liberation movement within the British Raj. And I won't get into all of the history because that would take up an episode of its own, but I just want to touch upon the year 1940 and the so-called Lahore Resolution or Pakistan Resolution, which was voted up by the All India Muslim Congress, which used to be the second largest party in the British Raj. Basically, what this Lahore Resolution called for was a separate homeland for the Muslims of the British Raj. This really introduced the idea of Pakistan into the political sphere of the time back then, and in the end led to important Muslim statesmen, particularly Muhammad Ali Jinnah, pushing for a Muslim homeland instead of one united India. This then led to a lot of problems in 1947 when Pakistan and India both became independent states. The British did not really do their job in making sure that the independence of both countries would be a clean process. So partition happened and a lot of horrors in the process, with Muslims being killed, Hindus being killed, Sikhs being killed on their way from Pakistan to India or from India to Pakistan. A lot of horrific crimes that were committed, frankly, on both sides.
Yes, common pattern we see when there's this decolonization process. There's people of different ethnicities, different tribes living right next to each other for centuries. And then you have this national partition where you say, okay, there's one ethnicity that gets a country and another one.
Yes.
And then they're forced to separate. And in this process, you have fights between the ethnicities and then horrors committed. Also in the case of India and Pakistan.
Exactly. So just for the listeners, if they are ever in Amritsar or in Delhi, I highly recommend visiting the partition museums there. The partition had a huge impact on the border between what we know today as India and Pakistan, but also back then, of course, Pakistan also included what we know today as Bangladesh. This does sometimes, I feel like, not receive the same kind of attention when we talk about partition as the horrors committed in the Punjab. You also really had a lot of these atrocities being committed in Bengal.
Which was also crazy that they established a new country, which was east of India and west of India. So a huge difference between different land parts. Of course, it did not hold forever. First, let's get to the wars fought between Pakistan and India.
Pakistan and India fought 3 major wars in 1947, 1965, and 1971. 47, 65, both on the issue of Kashmir, especially the 47 war, had a huge impact on the national identity of Pakistan, because the K in Pakistan stands for Kashmir. So Pakistan is an acronym. P for Punjab. A stands for the formerly Afghan territories, which we know today as the Pashtun territories in Afghanistan. K for Kashmir, S for Sindh, and the Stan ending for Balochistan. But that's just on a side note. The 47 war on Kashmir actually had a huge impact on the national identity of Pakistan, because Kashmir still up to today is seen by Pakistan as a central part of its territory. Pakistan not being able to incorporate the formerly princely state of Kashmir in 1947 into its own territory actually had a really devastating impact on a country which tried to forge a national identity around the issue of it being the homeland for all of the Muslims of the Indian subcontinent. And then basically one of the largest princely states with a Muslim majority not deciding to join Pakistan, of course, had a bad impact. And in 1965, there was the Second Kashmir War, which was also, I think, at its time, one of the largest wars in at least post-World War II history. Of course, then 1971, a huge watershed moment in the history of Pakistan, the war with India and the subsequent independence of Bangladesh. Again, I won't go into all of the history of the secession movement in what was then called East Pakistan. But basically, it revolved around the issue of a Bengali ethnic identity, which was suppressed by most of the West Pakistani political, but majority back then, military elites. In the end, it evolved into a huge movement around the Bengali identity, Bengali language, Bengali poetry. And with the help of India, actually, then Bangladesh became to be an independent state. Similarly to the situation in 47 with Kashmir, this also had a huge impact on the self-identity of Pakistan, because again, a large territory decided to become an independent state and didn't want to be a part of Pakistan anymore. That was definitely the biggest watershed moment, I think, in the history of Pakistan, 1971. Afterwards, after 71, there happened a lot of political unrest as well in Pakistan. The military fell after 71, so you had a rather small period then of civil rule under the leadership of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. But Zulfikar Ali Bhutto also then in the late 70s got displaced again by the military and by the rather infamous General Zia al-Haq, who then continued to rule Pakistan until, I think, the late 1980s, 1989, something like that, when he died in a plane crash. Right, and under the regime of General Zia, Pakistan saw a huge increase in Islamization, a rather sharp introduction also of Sharia law under his rule, but also, and that is, I think, very interesting from about foreign policy and security policy, General Zia partnered very closely with the United States, of course, then when it came about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which started in 1979. Under the leadership of General Zia, Pakistan really began to support a lot of Mujahideen groups in Afghanistan and also fostered a lot of these groups on its own territory, which then later
became the Taliban.
One of them became the Taliban, and still is a thorn in the back of Pakistan until today.
And also maybe to put this in the geopolitical context back then, so India, was it on the side of the Soviet Union?
India was a leader in the non-aligned movement, but practically it was more on the Soviet side.
They also had Soviet weapons, I think, historically until today. They are supplied with Russian weapons.
It has lessened a bit over the past years. So now India also, they are trying to have their own weapons industry and to become more self-sufficient, but they also have now France as a huge provider of weapons, but still Russia, of course, is the most important one still up to today. Yeah, but back then, India, leader in the non-aligned movement, but kind of closer to the Soviet Union, also because at home, the Indian National Congress back then was much more on the socialist side than it is perhaps today. And Pakistan, actually in the 1950s, very close ally of the United States, became a member of SEATO, became a member of CENTO. Both organizations don't exist anymore today, but they were kind of like smaller Asian versions of NATO, perhaps, to make it very easy. And then starting from the 1960s on, there were also much closer relations with the People's Republic of China.
Definitely.
Yeah. I think this really describes the most defining political trends in Pakistan since 47 or even 1940.
And now when we look at the contemporary political situation in Pakistan, we know that the military still holds a lot of power in the country.
Who is the most important political force? Probably, like, if you talk about Pakistani politics and who is at the helm of Pakistani politics, who becomes prime minister, who forms the government, who forms the coalition. Sadly, it's still the military will impact these decisions. When we talk about countries behaving diplomatically, we often talk about if Italy decides to do something. We often talk about Rome is behaving like this and that. We talk about Pakistan. Many people actually differentiate between saying Islamabad is doing this and that, because Islamabad, the capital, center of the political leadership of Pakistan, Rawalpindi, the twin city of Islamabad, but the garrison city of Pakistan, the headquarters of the Pakistani army in Rawalpindi. And I think this really shows that in an international arena, Islamabad always has to follow the say of Rawalpindi. And this also then translates to the domestic sphere in Pakistan. Right at the moment, Shehbaz Sharif is the prime minister of Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, which is named after his brother, Nawaz Sharif. So this is also a common theme in South Asian politics, political dynasties, but that's a different topic. But then, of course, also you have Imran Khan, leader of the PTI, former captain of the Pakistani cricket team, used to be one of the best cricket players in the world in the 1980s and 1990s, who was the prime minister of Pakistan from 2018 on, got deposed as prime minister, the first prime minister in the history of Pakistan who got deposed from his job, not by a military coup, but by a motion of no confidence, actually, in parliament. One can suspect that also the military was kind of behind this move.
So he was one of the prime ministers that went too far with the military, perhaps, in resisting its power too much?
He definitely stepped out of line of the military. One also has to keep in mind that he was not always a foe of the military. Interestingly, in the last elections last year in 2024, also his party, the PTI, was disqualified from actually. So then instead, a lot of independents who were aligned with the PTI then participated on its behalf and actually won, although they didn't, so then got to form a majority in parliament. Imran Khan said, this is a move of the military. They want to lessen my influence. They are basically against my party. They are against our movement. The election prior, Nawaz Sharif made the same talking points about the military, saying that the military is against the Muslim League. The military is pushing Imran Khan because Imran Khan is the military's pawn. Political dynamics change rather quickly in Pakistan, and a lot of this also happens behind closed doors, so we can't really always see the reasons why someone perhaps has stepped out of line with the military or with the ISI, the intelligence agency of Pakistan. But yeah, it is definitely something to keep an eye upon. Imran Khan now, he's in jail, and as is his wife. But he is still definitely, and I think actually, even though polling in Pakistan is a bit difficult, he probably is the most well-liked politician in Pakistan still. Has a lot to do with him being a national hero as the cricket captain of the only Pakistani cricket team that ever won the World Cup. He was also, as a politician, always quite a populist, unlike many other Pakistani politicians who always seem to be quite on the boring side of politics, very elitist, centrist kind of politicians, not very religious, even though Pakistan is an Islamic republic. And Imran Khan kind of filled this gap in Pakistan as a formerly very liberal sports hero of Pakistan, sports icon of Pakistan, who then became a very religious kind of person and also a very populist politician.
And if we look at the current government now and its agenda, what are the most important themes here?
The cleavages in the political systems are definitely quite different. We don't really have these cleavages as we have in Western Europe, that we have conservative or Christian democratic parties or social democratic parties, liberal green parties. We don't really have that in Pakistan. We have the Pakistan Muslim League, which is Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, which is the major center-right party, perhaps if we put it that way, in Pakistan. And we have the PPP, Pakistan People's Party, which is the major center-left party in Pakistan. These two parties over the past, since the early 1990s, used to be the most important political parties in Pakistan and the vehicles, basically political vehicles for individuals.
But what are their main goals? What do they want to achieve in Pakistan?
When we talk about the ideology of the Muslim League, really, it is quite difficult to say what their ideology actually is. They are kind of the center-right party in Pakistani politics. They are called the Muslim League, but they are also kind of a secular party, so they are not an Islamist party. There are other parties in Pakistan which are Islamist parties, like the Jamaat Islamiyah, but also other, even more radical Islamist parties in Pakistan, who have also been aligned with some of the Islamist militant extremist, perhaps even terrorist groups, choose the term you like. The Muslim League is, after all, a rather secular party. It is a Big Ten party, so you have people from all different kind of streams of life who might vote for the Muslim League. So it's not like other parties in Europe, for example, who have one specific target group of a population for whom they try to push their policies.
I think that's a good introduction to the internal politics of Pakistan, its history, the most defining moments. And War Diplomacy being a podcast about international relations, we will focus now on the external factors, on the relations with other actors, and we will first look at the regional relations in Block 2. So after the Taliban came back to power in 2021, I remember seeing many reports about the Taliban threatening to attack Pakistan, and where international commentators were saying perhaps there will be a war between the two countries. So what happened back then, and how are the relations between Pakistan and Afghanistan right now?
Okay, right now the relations are at its, I would say, most difficult point in quite a long time. I'll try to roll it up a bit from the back. So yes, in 2021, the Taliban came to power again in Afghanistan, actually with a lot of help from Pakistan. And Pakistan thought back then, I would also say that they made a win, that the Taliban being in power in Afghanistan would actually be good for them, because the Taliban, they were a proxy, I think one can really say, of Pakistan for a very long time. Pakistan never really was a friend of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Say in 2021, the mood was very, both Islamabad and Rawalpindi, that the Taliban came into power. Imran Khan, who was prime minister back then, also seemed to be quite happy about that. He said, I can loosely cite him, that Afghan people became sovereign again, that they shackled off the
shackles of colonization.
Yeah, something along the lines of that. But basically, the theme was the Afghan people became sovereign again, and that the Taliban would be actually good for Afghanistan and for Afghan relations. Now, a lot has changed since then. At the end of last year, the Pakistani army actually bombed Afghan territory with airstrikes, because they perceived that the Taliban sheltered militants on their own soil, who then would proceed to attack. Actually, what we can see over the past years is that there has been a huge upsurge in violence in Pakistan, especially in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which is the homeland in Pakistan, at least, of the Pashtun people, and runs along huge parts of the Afghan border. We also saw an upsurge of violence in Balochistan, but for different reasons. Right. And also, I think one interesting point which we see is that back in 1996, when the first Taliban regime came into power in Kabul, the Pakistani government back then exercised official diplomatic relations with the Taliban. They do also exercise, to a degree, of course, diplomatic relations with the Taliban now, but they have not officially recognized the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan as the internationally legal representation of Afghanistan. So this is also on a more of a diplomatic level.
I would say now let's get to India. Of course, we've mentioned the country before. Very complex relations because of the Kashmir region and both countries claiming ownership over this strip of land. How are relations between Pakistan and India now?
Relations between Pakistan and India are basically at the standstill, I would say, 2016.
What happened in 2016?
Oh, in 2016 you had attacks in Uri and in Pathankot in India. Those were two distinct attacks. One of them in Kashmir, yes. The other one in Indian Punjab. Those were two distinct attacks, but in both cases, gunmen from a militant terrorist group called Jaish-e-Mohammed attacked Indian military personnel, an Indian Air Force base, and a lot of Indian military personnel were killed in both of these attacks.
That this was not the Pakistani military attacking.
No,
There were some militant groups in Pakistan.
Yeah, so the Pakistani military will not attack India directly.
Both nuclear armed countries, so that could have tremendous consequences.
Right. So what Pakistan has been doing basically since 1989, when the Kashmir insurgency started in Indian Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, they have supported a lot of militant groups who operate in Indian Kashmir. Secessionist groups at start, also the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, which was not an Islamist group, which was more of a secessionist group. But yeah, they changed their patterns of support, the Pakistani army, the Pakistani intelligence services, basically since 1989. Very often, basically since the 1990s, they have been supporting Islamist proxies. I think we can actually also just call them terrorist groups. They are described as terrorist groups by most Western governments, by the Indian governments, of course, as well, like Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and many other ones as well. And yes, Jaish-e-Mohammed was responsible for both of these attacks in 2016. There were numerous other attacks over the last decade in Kashmir. And yeah, this has always been a thorn in relations between both of these countries.
And what is the official Pakistani reaction to these attacks? Do they apologize to India for that formally?
I would be surprised actually if they would have formally apologized for these attacks.
So they're not officially attacking them, but Pakistan is sort of tolerating these kinds of acts.
Because if they would have formally apologized for these, that's at least thought. If they would have formally apologized to India for attacks conducted by terrorist groups, they would say
they're responsible.
They are responsible for supporting these terrorist groups and them being able to conduct these terrorist attacks.
But they sort of are responsible for that because they have in part supported these militias.
Yes, and in many cases, there's also proof that these militias are, I don't actually like to call them militias. I mean, from a purely academic standpoint, perhaps it's better to call them militias or militants, but in my opinion, they are terrorists. There has been evidence that the Pakistani military and the ISI have been propping these groups up and have also given them military training, have sheltered them.
And the same we heard back then when the US was at war with the Taliban in Afghanistan, that the Taliban were sheltered by the Pakistani secret service and military. The US were fighting them on the Afghan territory, but then they just retreated in part to Pakistan and got resources there and attacked again and conducted all of these terrorist attacks. So maybe a bottom line to say is that Pakistan is causing some instability in the region, not only in India, but also beyond the Indian conflict.
Yes, and this has been a case since the 1980s in both theaters, Afghanistan and Kashmir, that Pakistan has always tried, I mean, purely from the view of national strategic interest, it also makes some kind of sense to find ways to push their own national interest, security interests. One can debate whether it's very sustainable, because I think the situation which we see right now between Pakistan and Afghanistan pretty much tells you that it's not very sustainable to prop up and support Islamist militant terrorist groups, because in the end it will backfire. And perhaps just to also very shortly come back to the issue of the Taliban, we didn't talk about that earlier. There are, of course, the Afghan Taliban, but there are also the Pakistani Taliban, Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan. And the Pakistani Taliban are actually the ones who are responsible in large parts for the upsurge in violence, especially in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan. Not so much the Afghan Taliban, because they are not conducting attacks within Pakistan, but of course they are very closely aligned with the Pakistani Taliban. They are both connected basically by the roots in the Pashto ethnicity, language, culture, and so on. You can also still see this that up till today, the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan has never been recognized by Afghanistan. The Durand Line has never been recognized by any government in Kabul since 1949, including the Taliban.
So do you think there could be more severe tensions in the future between the two countries?
Yes, I think so. At least the Pakistani Taliban have issued these warnings quite recently that people in Pakistan should be on alert, and that they, and also civilians, should not enter any military bases, police bases, or be too close to such points of interest for the Pakistani Taliban. And since the Pakistani Taliban and the Afghan Taliban are closely connected, this will have repercussions, sadly, for relations between Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Okay, I think with that we've summed up some of the important part of the regional relations. Of course, there's always more what one could discuss, but with Afghanistan and India, we've covered two of the most important borders. So let's zoom out again from the regional relations to the global relations of Pakistan. And we don't hear Pakistan a lot in the media, but usually when you hear about it in the West, it's about the relations between Pakistan and China, especially in the context of India perhaps improving relations with the West. We have, for example, the Quad Agreement, which seeks to contain Chinese power in Southeast Asia. We have China aligning more closely with Pakistan. So, Kevin, how has China become such a crucial partner for Pakistan in recent years?
Yeah, it is actually not so much a recent thing that there is this close degree of partnership, and actually also, I mean, on a diplomatic level, Chinese and Pakistani officials will call it a friendship. This has been a thing which is going on basically since the 1960s. I think in 1951, Pakistan was actually the first Muslim majority country that recognized the People's Republic of China diplomatically over back then the Republic of China, which was back then mostly seen as the legitimate international representation of the Chinese people. But as I also touched upon a bit earlier, in the 1950s, Pakistan was still very closely aligned with the United States strategically, and not so much with the Chinese in the 50s. This really changed in the 1960s, because one has to keep in mind always the factor when you talk about Pakistan-China relations, the factor of India. So it's always kind of a triangle. In the 50s, India and China were still very friendly towards each other. There was always this talk about Hindi, Chini, Pai Pai, Indian-Chinese friendship. Nehru was very keen on having good relations with the Chinese as part of this kind of
Socialist brotherhood?
socialist brotherhood. I mean, definitely the Chinese communists were much more to the left than Nehru. Nehru was a Western educated socialist, but he was not a communist, certainly not a Maoist. But for Nehru, it was always about the struggle of the colonized people to decolonize and to form a bloc against both the so-called First World back then, but also Second World, which was back then, of course, the non-aligned movement, his vehicle to push for these kind of policies. But Nehru was also perhaps a bit naive in this, because he did not view the Chinese as a political or as a strategic threat to India. And yeah, this was a mistake by him, because then in 1962, the Chinese attacked India. There was the border war between the Chinese and India, which the Indians lost quite devastatingly. And this then also really changed relations between China and Pakistan, because from this point on, both the Chinese and the Pakistanis saw themselves as kind of partners against India.
To sum up the geopolitical situation, one could say that both Pakistan and India stayed politically on the left, but India rather aligned with the Soviet Union and Pakistan rather aligned with China, which also makes sense because we obviously had under Mao the Sino-Soviet split, and when Stalin died and Khrushchev took over, the relations between the Soviet Union and China worsened. So suddenly across the world, you had socialist countries either deciding between one side or the other. An odd example that I like here is Albania. Albania decided to rather side with China rather than the Soviet Union. And yeah, we also saw the split in Pakistan and India. Perhaps to move on, how does the relationship between China and Pakistan look like? We hear a lot about the Belt and Road Initiative and that China is investing a lot of money in the country. Is this creating some dangerous dependencies, which is often alleged in the West, or is this a healthy partnership?
Yes and no when it comes to the dependencies. The investment certainly should be seen as a big chance for Pakistan because, frankly speaking, the US was always interested in Pakistan mainly because of strategic reasons. Talking about Afghanistan, talking about the war on terror in the Cold War as a partner against the Soviet Union. But it was never so much interested in Pakistan as to, that the US would have a lot of FTI, for instance, in Pakistan. Development assistance, yes, but just from just looking at trade and just looking at investments, not so much. Same to a certain degree also applies to Europe. I mean, the European Union is an important trading partner for Pakistan, but not to the same degree as China is. So yes, the investment can be seen as a chance, but has it actually paid off? Has it actually worked? Especially looking at CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is really one of the most important economic corridors within the Belt and Road Initiative. I think one can say that it has not really paid off so far. So it is actually quite interesting when you look at CPEC or the history of CPEC, that the Memorandum of Understanding on CPEC,
So China, Pakistan.
the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, was already signed in July 2013. The Belt and Road Initiative as a concept was only announced by Xi Jinping later in September 2013. So the Memorandum of Understanding on CPEC was announced before the actual Belt and Road Initiative.
Context for our listeners, the Belt and Road Initiative is this global initiative by the Chinese Communist Party where they are investing in countries across the world to strengthen its economic ties and perhaps also to create new partners to export their goods in the future. It's a lot about infrastructure to bring Chinese goods abroad, but also to strengthen economies, allowing them to grow.
And yeah, in the case of CPEC and in the case of Chinese-Pakistani cooperation, CPEC was very important to the Chinese, and they had really high hopes that this initiative would pay off. But when we look actually at the results of CPEC and how CPEC looks today, it is a rather sad scene because yes, the Chinese are still involved and they will probably also still be involved in the coming years because this project, this initiative is simply too big to fail for them, but it has not lived up to its potential. So one prime example for this is the port city of Gwadar, which is in Balochistan. Balochistan is a very volatile region in Pakistan.
Because of these separatist groups that are...
Exactly, because of separatist, secessionist groups in Balochistan who don't want to be a part of Pakistan. Interestingly, we have similar dynamics also on the other side of the border in Iran. But because Balochistan has been so volatile and there's been also so much resistance by these Baloch separatists against Chinese presence and against Chinese influence in their own region, there have been a lot of attacks against Chinese nationals, Chinese contractors, Chinese companies who work in the region. And the Chinese are not happy that their own people are being killed in this initiative for which they have paid so much money, right? WADA was supposed to be this crown jewel of the CPEC with this supposedly huge port, which would be so important for shipping and which would be so important for commerce activities of the Chinese, surpassing basically the Strait of Malacca and this, basically having a shortcut via Pakistan, the Arab Sea, and the Middle East to the world, to the Indian Ocean.
Maybe just to give context here, one of the biggest weak points of China is the Strait of Malacca, which is east of India. And this is a narrow strait where a lot of the ships that supply China with the fossil fuels that it needs to run its economies need to pass through. And India, in a war situation, could theoretically close the Strait of Malacca, and that would deeply hurt China's economy. And that's why Pakistan could be such a great partner, because it would allow them to open a new trade corridor and to skip the Strait of Malacca. And that's why they invested so heavily in that port, because if you increase the capacity of this port, it can replace all the capacities that you used to bring through the Strait of Malacca, or at least a significant part of it.
Yes, well, at least in theory, because if you look actually and what has been happening in Guadalajara, there has not been a lot happening in Guadalajara. It is still a vastly underdeveloped city. Most streets in Guadalajara are unpaved. It is also not a very large city, one really has to say. It's a bit more than, I think, 100,000 people only living there. Interestingly, there is another port in Pakistan which is quite important for international shipping commerce, which is the port of Karachi, which is at least not officially a part of the CPEC and the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think the port of Gwadar has roughly seen kind of 1% of the traffic of the port of Karachi. So, I mean, this really puts things into perspective. And yeah, after roughly 55 billion US dollars, which were invested by the Chinese in aid and credit for highway projects, infrastructure projects such as the development of Gwadar, power projects, energy grids, which are very important for Pakistan. Pakistan has a huge energy problem with a lot of energy outages, also rescue loans. CPEC really has struggled to take off and to generate sustained economic benefits. It has struggled to circumvent the structural problems of the Pakistani economy, also the structural problems of the Pakistani economy being very closely tied to the military complex in Pakistan. So, I mean, I won't get into the details of that, but there was a great book on this published a few years ago by Ayesha Siddiqa, which introduced this term milbus for Pakistan, which really emphasizes how the Pakistani military has really built this network, companies and relations also with companies which were perhaps initially did not see that much of an influence by the military, but to have then this kind of influence in these companies. And as a result, you have seen a lot of nepotism, corruption, Pakistan, which has benefited some people, but which has worked against the interests of the economy as a whole. Some people thought that CPEC could benefit the Pakistani economy and could also work against these influences which the Pakistani military holds. But so far, at least, this did not really pay off. And perhaps one last point, just recently, a few weeks ago, the new international airport in Gwadar opened, which is theoretically could be the largest airport in Pakistan now. And it was also a huge project under the umbrella of CPEC, and the Chinese invested a lot of money in it. But there was no Chinese representation at all at the opening of the airport. One could see many reasons for that, but we come back again to the issue of security around CPEC. People think that the Chinese simply did not attend with their ambassador or even someone from the Chinese foreign ministry because they were scared that there would be an attack on them by Baluch separatists. And I think this really tells you a lot about the state of CPEC.
What about the US and Europe? Does the West care about Pakistan still today? or do they just leave the country to China and don't think it's strategically important enough for them to still have that influence there?
Okay, let's differentiate that a bit between perhaps the United States and the European Union. The United States, one really has to say, at least under the administration of Joe Biden, did not really care about Pakistan. There was a drawback of the United States from Pakistan already to a degree under the first Trump administration. But because of the Afghanistan issue, Trump did still care to a degree about Pakistan, because Pakistan was, of course, a very important interlocutor in the talks with the Taliban, in the Doha talks. His special envoy, Trump's special envoy for Afghanistan, visited Pakistan, I think something like 15 times during his term. And Trump also had a good personal relationship, actually, with Imran Khan, which
Was president of Pakistan back then.
Prime Minister.
Prime Minister, yeah.
Of Pakistan, yeah. Back then, yes. So at least there was still engagement under the first Trump administration. Under the Biden administration, it really was quite sad to see, because Biden had the drawback from Afghanistan, and then afterwards it seemed like he saw this as a closed chapter. He did not want to go back to Afghanistan, and by engaging with Pakistan, you always to some degree also return to Afghanistan, to the topic of Afghanistan. And perhaps that was one reason why Joe Biden simply decided to have no engagement whatsoever with Pakistani politicians. Joe Biden was the first US president who did not call a Pakistani prime minister at least once during his time in office. And this is really something. And then tie that also to the issue that the US has in general a quite negative image in Pakistan because of the way it behaved also during the war on terror, talking about drone attacks, especially in Pakistan, infringements on Pakistani sovereignty, which is always a hot topic in South Asia. When you infringe on the country's sovereignty, it's the worst thing you can basically do for a South Asian country. And interestingly, Pakistan and India are very much on the same page when it comes to this. And also, of course, then quite recently as well, the strong support of the United States for Israel in the Israel-Hamas war just added to the extremely negative image of the United States. And it is, for me, really difficult to forecast how the US can really change their image to a positive in Pakistan over the coming years. Perhaps the return of Trump to the presidency might make things a bit better. It is difficult to forecast, but thinking that he had really good relations with Imran Khan, if Imran Khan and if the PTI were to come back to power in Pakistan, perhaps this would be good for US-Pakistan relations. But
as with Trump plans trying or now announcing that he wants to turn the Gaza Strip into a sort of America-controlled Riviera, I think the chances of gaining popularity in a still democratic Muslim majority country will be difficult, no?
It's of course an issue, right? I mean, you never know with Donald Trump what's his next idea and how he will translate that to foreign audiences. Yeah, definitely. If these plans were to succeed, this would also not be very good for relations between the US and Pakistan, and frankly, the US and most Muslim countries around the world. Also, when we look at the people he has put in charge of US foreign policy, people like Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, those are, of course, famous for being China hawks. And if you put in China hawks into power for the United States foreign policy, this might also then make things a bit more difficult for the relations between the US and Pakistan, because you would basically tell the Pakistanis to choose sides between China and the United States. And I think, given the recent history of relations between the countries, the Pakistanis would be inclined to rather choose the Chinese.
Now let's get to the European Union. How are relations between Pakistan and the EU?
Relations between the European Union and Pakistan are mostly centered around trade. The EU is Pakistan's second most important trading partner after China. It accounted, I think, for roughly 15% of Pakistan's total trade in 2023, which is, if you compare it to other countries, quite a lot. Also, the EU accounts for a substantial share of Pakistan's exports, especially, of course, in the sector of textiles and garments. This is perhaps a bit of a different problem for the Pakistani economy on a structural level, that it is very dependent on these kind of sectors, but still, at least as of now, the share of exports, especially also to the EU, is very important for Pakistan. The generalized scheme of preferences also provides Pakistan with preferential access to the EU market, and it has also contributed towards a really substantial increase in trade between both parties. And interestingly also, Pakistan is really the largest beneficiary also of that scheme, of the GSP Plus scheme. Yeah, as a result of the GSP Plus, actually more than 78% of Pakistan's exports enter the EU at preferential rates. And without that, if this scheme would not be in place, it would significantly decrease also Pakistan's export economy. So yeah, for at least on this level, the EU-Pakistan relations are quite good, and also very important, especially for Pakistan. But in 2027, the GSP Plus is set to expire. So for it to be renewed, Pakistan might also have to look into complying with the new rules which the US put forth, like the due diligence directive, sustainability standards, labor standards. So this is something which we have to perhaps observe a bit over the next 2 years, how Pakistan is going to comply with these sets of regulations which the EU has put forth.
We know that environmental and labor standards are very low in Pakistan, obviously. The working population suffering under it. Also, textile industry can cause a lot of damage to the local environment with chemicals. So something, of course, Pakistan could benefit from, but on the other hand, it can create more economic costs in a region that is already, constrained by poverty.
Yeah, and perhaps on just one more point on EU-Pakistan relations, one also, of course, has to look at development assistance, and this might now, looking again at the United States, completely redefining their own development policy and development assistance. EU development assistance to Pakistan might become more important, and might also become a tool for the EU to increase their own capacities and their own influence via soft power in Pakistan. Falls also the issue of Israel Gaza is also a bit difficult for the EU, but I would say not to the same degree as for the US. Yeah, so perhaps that's a chance actually also for the EU. The drawback from the United States to gain more influence, and perhaps also to at least try to counter China a tiny bit in Pakistan.
Thank you for this very comprehensive overview, Calvin. Maybe let's make a final concluding statement. Let's try to put all of this, what we have analyzed in the past more than an hour, and try to make a conclusion about the state of Pakistan and the road ahead. Calvin, one of my favorite books in international relations is Why Nations Fail from Acemoglu and Robinson. It describes why nations turn out to be either wealthy or poor, and the main explanation here is that you need stable laws, stable institutions governing a country, allowing people to accumulate wealth and to basically work for their own prosperity, which then in turn benefits the entire nation. And looking at Pakistan, we hear a lot about instability, we hear a lot about corruption. So when I consider what China has been doing, which is essentially giving a lot of money in the region, giving some maybe structural support, but overall not tackling these structural issues by the root, I'm not surprised that this has not worked out and that we still see these big issues of poverty, and lack of stability persisting in Pakistan. You can't just throw money at a problem. It's something that has been done extensively in the past with developmental support in developing countries and which has not worked. So if you consider the future of Pakistan and how things could improve, what's your overall picture? Are you optimistic about Pakistan?
I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm optimistic, but I'm also not pessimistic. I think if you look at Pakistan and its trajectory since independence, I find it quite remarkable that Pakistan has always resisted falling apart. Even though you just pointed a lot of issues out on a structural level, economic level, corruption, that the institutions don't necessarily work quite well. One would think that at some point, especially if it is paired up with so many different ethnicities speaking different languages, having different also perhaps ethnic and religious affiliations to a degree, that the country might just fall apart. So yes, to a degree in 71 it did fall apart a bit because Bangladesh became independent, but apart from 71, Pakistan has resisted this danger of falling apart. And I think Pakistan will also not fall apart, at least in the future. However, I also am quite pessimistic about Pakistan being able to actually change all of these problems which you just mentioned to a better, simply because it would work against the interests of the military in Pakistan. And as long as the military is thus central for the Pakistani state, and as long as it is also essential for Pakistan's diplomatic relations with other countries around the world, I struggle to see that much will change. Similarly to India, I would say that the Pakistani population is actually very keen on having a dynamic country. Also, comparing it to India, you will see that, like India, which has a very vibrant democracy, which has its faults, Pakistan also has a quite vibrant democracy, which kind of has to resist these infringements of the military. But looking at the 2024 elections, I think this was a great point in case. The military did almost everything they could, other than, just shutting down the elections and taking over again, to decrease the influence of the PTI, Imran Khan's party. And the PTI, as I said, it couldn't even officially participate in the elections. But people still voted majority for independent candidates affiliated with the PTI. So this really, I think, tells you a lot about the way Pakistani people really are keen on having democracy working for them and participating also in democratic elections. And I think this is always a good starting point from which things can get better.
Maybe on a concluding remark, we have the military, which largely benefits from the corruption persisting and the structural issues persisting in Pakistan. But on the opportunity side, we have the people and we have the democracy, which can still bring about the necessary change to drive prosperity in the country.
Yes, and also, I mean, looking at the civil society side of it, Pakistan has quite a well-working media environment. Actually, if you look at rankings of media freedom in the world, Pakistan ranks higher than India. So you have really, I think, great newspapers which have been doing a lot of good work for many decades. And yeah, I think you concluded it quite well. There are definitely negative influences by the military, by corruption, nepotism, so on. But on the positive side, yes, you have a civil society which is keen on change and which is keen on having a country that actually works for them. Of course, one will always have to see how secessionist movements like in Balochistan, to a degree also in the Pashtun regions, will affect the country, and whether also then external influences like the Taliban supporting the Pakistani Taliban, or Iranian Baluch militias supporting Baluch militias in Pakistan, will affect the country. this is difficult to forecast, of course. I think that Pakistan will not fall apart, at least, and that it will still have a democracy which has its limitations, but in the limitations in which it works, will try to do good work.
And with that, we close our episode today. Thank you, Calvin, for joining us. And also thank you to our dear listeners for tuning in. And we're looking forward to bring news to you very soon. Bye-bye.